All right, we are live. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Virginia 21's Student Hangouts. Today's topic is combating campus sexual violence. For those of you who don't already know, Virginia 21 is a student advocacy organization. We advocate for young people and young people's issues. We bring together young voters from all across the Commonwealth to help make an impact on the issues that matter most to them. We have worked closely with students, with lawmakers, with university leaders, and allied advocacy groups to help influence legislation addressing the issue of sexual violence on college campuses this year. We're very pleased that the General Assembly was able to work together and pass some meaningful legislation that strengthens policies and protects students' rights and privacy. We want to thank the governor, his administration, and the Attorney General for their leadership on creating the task force to develop some additional recommendations to keep young people safe on college campuses. We're very excited to have Secretary Brian Moran with us today. He is the Secretary of Public Safety and Homeland Security, and he's going to discuss some of the task force's recommendations on combating sexual violence. We will start with a brief overview from Secretary Moran, then we'll take some questions from a few of our students, and then we will move on to some questions from the audience. So if you have questions or thoughts, stay engaged with us on social media using the hashtag VA21Hangout. Secretary Moran, I will toss it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to be able to engage in this forum. I look forward to it. I have great personal admiration for Virginia 21, having worked with them when I was in the state legislature. I actually hired a previous executive director of Virginia 21 to work as my legislative aide with Jesse Ferguson, who is now in New York working for the candidacy of Hillary Clinton. So he's terrific, and well, there's David Solimini, Brian Cannon. You're occupying a vaunted chair at Virginia 21. They do fabulous work advocating on behalf of college students in Virginia. So I'm invited to chat about the governor's executive order, which was signed back in August of 2014, creating the Sexual Assault Task Force. One of the hallmarks of Governor McAuliffe's administration is the collaborative effort and working across secretariats. So this executive order was signed creating the task force, calling upon several secretaries to work on this issue. As Secretary of Public Safety, I bring law enforcement to the table, but then also the governor asked Secretary Ann Holton, Secretary of Education, to serve on as a co-chair, as well as Bill Hazel, the Secretary of Health and Human Resources. And we were all to work with our Attorney General, Mark Herring. And the task force was expanded to include the college presidents, community colleges, law enforcement representatives, advocacy, sexual assault advocates, and many others, students as well, to wrestle with these issues. Now, this was August of 2014. There was some activity on the federal level. President Obama and Vice President Joe Biden had addressed this issue. So nationally, there was awareness, and of course, this was on the eve of the college season beginning in September. Shortly thereafter, of course, this issue became even more urgent and relevant. We had the case of Hannah Graham at the University of Virginia, where missing college student on the campus, and then we had what is now known as a fairly spurious Rolling Stone article, but one that you would read and become quite angry that this could the heinous crime that was depicted in that article could occur on a college campus here in Virginia. So that took on some urgency. The task force worked on, in a very collaborative fashion. We've had numerous meetings as well as subgroups bringing together the various experts to make recommendations to the governor. And we are now in a position to make a number of recommendations. We have a draft report that we're going to be providing. The governor will be voting on that draft report May 28th of this year, May 28th, just a couple of weeks. So a lot of work has been done. I want to thank all of the members of the task force. I think it was a a relevant exercise. I think it's one that will improve the safety on our college campuses and to help eliminate the sexual assault on our college campuses here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. So that's a kind of an introduction to the work, and happy to answer any specific questions. Well, let me couple of things it addresses. Because of the activity last fall and the attention that it received, there was legislative action this last legislative session. Obviously, legislators responded to current events, and they passed a number of bills that are before the governor and have been signed by the governor. And so as the task force worked its way through bringing together a very collaborative and a variety of stakeholders to work out these issues, the legislature was presented with a variety of issues because of what occurred in Charlottesville, and so they adopted some legislation, and we're going to try to work through those pieces of legislation as the task force, and combine. And so this will be supplementing what the legislature did as well. And so we weren't at cross purposes in any way. Hopefully, they will work to supplement each other, and again, ultimately make our campuses safer. So with that, look forward to answering any questions you might have.
Okay, thank you, Secretary Moran. First, we are going to go to Ryan from George Mason University. He's got the first question for us. So, Ryan, go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Secretary Moran, for being here with us. I just wanted to ask, could you tell us a little bit more about the sexual assault response teams that these recommendations set up and how these groups will assist survivors?
Great. Sexual assault, SARTs, sexual assault response teams, many of them already exist at our college campuses. Essentially what it is trying to bring together those entities that would be responsible to bringing a case to court in addition to responding to the victim's needs. So you have law enforcement as a part of the team, but then also sexual awareness, sexual assault awareness teams. You might actually have nurses as well, and campus law enforcement, of course, would be involved, and a prosecutor. It speaks to the bigger issue here, Ryan, in that we want to encourage reporting of sexual assault on our campuses. But time and again, we would hear from victims saying they're very reluctant to report because of all the associated risks that are involved. It was a real challenge. And so what we thought is if we could have a team around the table so that we could improve the process by which one could report, protecting the personal information, for instance, until necessary, that it would be helpful. Again, it's a collaborative effort. We learn so much from working with other entities that deal, and they should be working together, not at cross purposes. The information that's shared with a victim, for instance, really should be consistent. They shouldn't be receiving information from one entity that's different from another, and so their interaction with the campus itself, typically a faculty member, Title IX coordinator, that information should be consistent, and so a team working together, communicating, working in a collaborative fashion. So the SARTs, I started by saying many of them already existed. What our recommendation as a part of the task force is, one, it recognizes their importance and their beneficial impact to addressing sexual assault on campuses. And so we're formalizing what is now kind of a loose agreement. They meet occasionally. Some are better than others. And so we really want to adopt that as a best practice and require them to meet on a more regular basis. So that will be one of our strong recommendations as a result of the task force.
Okay, great. Thank you. Our next question is from Danny at Norfolk State University. Danny, go ahead with your question.
Okay. Good afternoon, Secretary Moran. My question is, do you think these recommendations will be supported by the universities in the Commonwealth? And also, how will these recommendations be applied to the university, if they choose to support them?
Sure. I do believe they will be well received by the universities because the universities have played a large role in creating the recommendations. They have been at the table with us to discuss, develop, and ultimately recommend these policy recommendations. So I think they will be well received, and they've helped craft them and write them. So um, they will, they've had a hand in making them. The cost, I think you mentioned the cost and associated with them. I don't think there'll be a substantial demand for revenue on these things. Many of the things have already started at some campuses. We want to expand them because they're a form of best practice. But if there are funding requests, we're obviously have an opportunity to review those before May 28th and then thereafter as we start to work on the governor's budget for next legislative session.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. We had a student who was trying to connect and we couldn't get on, Sammy, who just earned a master's degree from James Madison University, and her question was, how much will it cost to start these initiatives, and will the state be willing to support the funding for them?
Mm-hmm. Well, funding, I appreciate you all being very cost conscious. We are cost conscious in Virginia. But let me say, as we ensure the safety in our college campuses, the cost was not our paramount concern. Our paramount concern is recognizing, identifying best practices, and then implementing them across our colleges and universities here in Virginia. We will now start to apply some, what the cost would be of these recommendations, and then come up with the necessary resources. I do not anticipate many of them being particularly costly because a lot of it is already being done at some of the colleges, and it's more of a culture on our campuses to adopt a culture that addresses a survivor responding a trauma-informed response. So it's more developing a better approach that works with the victim in a survivor-oriented approach to reporting. And if we can do that, you'll increase the number of reports of sexual assaults on our campuses. So a lot of this is more with respect to developing the appropriate response, one that is trauma-informed, developing a better culture on campus that would encourage reporting because there are better responses and a better approach to the survivor. So much of this is not necessarily costly, rather than adopting best practices. Okay,
great. If it's okay with you, we're now going to go over to Twitter, and we'll take some questions off Twitter from our viewers. The first one we have is, how are you planning to train police more effectively and compassionately to respond to survivors?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it really is how you respond initially. And it's not just police, though police play an extremely important role in this, as well as the prosecutor's office. But it even starts before that. It's a trauma-informed response. It starts with the nurse, for example, at the hospital, where a survivor would go to provide a perk kit. And it's the forensic nurse. It's the sexual assault nurse examiner. We refer to as saying sexual assault nurse examiner or forensic nurse examiner. It's that approach initially and the attitude that's reflected by those individuals at the very beginning of the process that helps develop a better reporting system, and so that a survivor feels more comfortable in that setting. So it starts early in the process, and all of them need to be trained in a trauma-informed way. Law enforcement, we will dedicate resources to training them through our Department of Criminal Justice Services, which, as Secretary of Public Safety, I have the honor to have them as one of the 11 agencies of which I oversee within the Secretariat. We will work with them to develop better training methods. Again, this is nationally. We'll adopt best practices. There are a number of groups nationally that have done a lot of work in this area, and we'll make sure that our campus law enforcement agencies, as well as local law enforcement agencies, have the tools necessary so that they can provide a better a better survivor-oriented approach to policing. I should mention VCU. Chief John Venuti is the chief at VCU, and he was a member of this panel. He's been out to Oregon, has adopted a survivor-oriented approach, and he's investigated that and shared a lot of that information with us. Again, this is about adopting best practices so that we can create a better culture on campus to support the survivor. So training is a big component of that, and we will adopt the necessary training to accomplish it.
Okay, speaking of VCU, the next question is from VCU Student Government Association. They ask, what did Virginia do as a part of the Start by Believing campaign this year?
Yeah, great. Start by Believing. That's a model that has been promoted by Violence Against Women International group. In fact, they invited me to speak on a panel in New Orleans recently at their national conference. They've developed Start by Believing, again, changing the culture, not only on campuses but families, friends, so that there is a supportive environment. If a sexual assault is reported by a survivor, that you have the necessary support system to her or him, so that they can maneuver and through the system and ultimately report it to the police. But Start by Believing is just as simple as it sounds. You know, you start from the very beginning, believing the story and supporting the survivor, and we endorse that as part of our recommendations in the task force.
Someone else asked, while we're on Start by Believing, somebody else had asked how you see that working from an implementation standpoint, how the colleges in Virginia will implement the Start by Believing campaign.
Well, it's a public awareness campaign. That's what End Violence Against Women have sponsored. They have provided us some tools necessary to communicate Start by Believing campaign, and then you do a public awareness campaign. And it should be a part of our discussion as we adopt new training techniques for our law enforcement, for our school faculty. This is something we will share with SHEV, State Council of Higher Education, how they want to implement it on the college campuses. We want to have them be a part of the solution. So SHEV and other personnel, college administrators and so forth should be aware of it and aware of the tools necessary to adopt and implement Start by Believing campaign.
Okay, moving to the law enforcement side of things, with the recommendations about perk kit retention coming from the task force, will the lack of law enforcement storage space, do you see that being a significant issue with perk retention?
That's a challenge, but it's one we should accept and fix. With respect to the perk, initially a survivor or victim may not want the case to proceed, and so at that point in time they say they don't want a perk, or shortly after the perk is taken they want it destroyed. One of the recommendations from the task force will be to retain the perk for a longer period of time, and thus the storage challenge. But we want to retain it for longer because that is a crucial piece of evidence, and we want that retained because the survivor may change their mind. If we adopt the Start by Believing campaign, if we have a better survivor-oriented approach, you will see victims want to proceed with a prosecution of the case. But that may not be in the the first day, or even the first week, maybe even not at the first month. And so we want to adopt policies that will maintain the evidence longer. That's why you saw it both in the task force and particularly in the pieces of legislation that went through the legislature this last session. They involved prosecutors and law enforcement earlier, because you want a set of eyes on the case from a prosecutorial perspective to say, you need to maintain the evidence. You need to collect the evidence early in the process. Even if the case decides, the survivor decides not to go forward, but if that were to change, you need that evidence later on in the process. So that is important, and that's why I think the legislature and these recommendations address those issues so that we can indeed have a successful prosecution if the survivor decides to go forward.
Okay, staying with law enforcement, we had a question. Lots of these initiatives involve the police, and we know that some survivors may not be comfortable working with the police. So how do we navigate that space?
Yeah. Well, that's a challenging space. This past legislative session, there were a number of bills that were put in. You would refer to them as mandatory reporting bills, that if a sexual assault was reported to a faculty member or any college employee, that employee would be responsible to report it to the local police. And that was strenuously objected to by sexual assault advocates as well as victims themselves, who came and gave very compelling testimony before the committees. They said if they thought their information would be shared, they would not have come forward at all. And obviously that is not the culture we want to create. We want to create an environment where someone would feel comfortable coming forward. And so, and including law enforcement, they'll be at first. The first will be the campus community. The information will go to the Title IX coordinator, campus law enforcement, and then a student affairs representative. And only then, if they decide that it is a safety risk, that the case is so serious that it would present a risk to the campus and the public, then they will contact the local law enforcement. So there is several stages to the process, and so that clearly has been a major issue of contention from the victim advocates and those in law enforcement, trying to achieve a balance that where folks are satisfied. And that may be something we'll have to revisit, but we got legislation through that hopefully balances the two, so that we can indeed provide the survivor what she needs, and at the same time prosecute those who would commit these acts on our campuses.
Right. And somebody else asked, do you anticipate the mandatory reporting legislation is likely to reappear as an issue during this next General Assembly session?
Well, it's a great question. Now, I'd caution you to refer to it as a mandatory reporting, whoever asked the question. It's shy of mandatory reporting. I'll tell you, early on in the process, the legislation started as mandatory reporting because it actually would have assessed penalties for those who did not report it. So when it started out, the survivor went to a faculty member. And if the faculty member did not report the crime, they would have been subject to jail time. That was one version of the bill. Another version of the legislation would have subjected them to civil penalties, large fines. Now that is mandatory reporting. That had all been stripped out of the legislation. That is no longer in the legislation. Now that faculty member, once they receive that information, is responsible to go to the Title IX coordinator. And the Title IX coordinator, which is one on every campus, then that Title IX coordinator convenes a team with the student affairs representative as well as campus law enforcement. Then they determine whether or not they should go to local law enforcement. So again, hopefully it tries to achieve that balance. But we may revisit it, and as the question insinuated, maybe we will have to revisit it. It was not a recommendation of our task force. That was a piece of legislation separate from the task force work. Certainly one that we weighed in on, and ultimately the governor signed it. But we may revisit that next session if it's not working.
Okay. You said before that police officers need training so that they can provide a trauma-informed response. Somebody else on Twitter has asked, what about training for students?
Well, that's a great question, and I'm trying to recall what the discussion was within the task force. A number of colleges have already on their own gone about trying to create more education. There are courses provided now, I understand, before the student starts school about sexual assault awareness. I think I would encourage our colleges and universities to do that. The more aware students are, and the students themselves, to protect themselves for one, but then those students who become aware of information, what they do with that information is important as well. So I would encourage some form of training. It is not a part of our task force recommendation formally to do that. I think it's more in terms of the professionals that have to deal with this case as opposed to students, but it's certainly something that the colleges and universities are free to investigate and pursue.
Okay, great.
I should mention, to follow up on that, we're also not just colleges and universities, but we're also recommending within our task force that K through 12, some education takes place in the earlier grades, certainly in high school, become more sexual assault awareness training takes place, more education takes place in our K through 12 settings as well, and that's a part of our recommendation.
Yeah, and that's most definitely important. We've had several questions on this topic. We have all these recommendations. Some of them are really great and would be really helpful, but obviously
they're all really great. We have 22 recommendations. I guess they're all great to some extent.
But of course, the key is what recommendations can you turn into legislation, and of that legislation, what can you get through with political realities being what they are. What recommendations do you see as most likely to be proposed in the General Assembly as legislation in this upcoming session? What recommendations do you see as maybe having a tough time getting through the General Assembly? What are your thoughts on that? How things will fare in this upcoming session?
Well, the beauty of an executive level task force is a lot of this can be done through executive action, working with Chev, working with the college presidents, working with campus law enforcement. A lot of this can be adopted as best practices as opposed to legislation. Though I will say, I think we mentioned earlier, I think the legislature would be receptive to our recommendations, but they do not all require actual legislation themselves. I think much of this we can accomplish through policies with DCJS, Department of Criminal Justice Services, in terms of additional training, but then on our campus law enforcement, our faculty, college presidents doing this at that level as opposed to legislative action. Much of this is better done if it's done organically at the local level as opposed to the top down. The state telling college presidents what to do is not necessarily well received. So that's why they've been at the table. They've really been a part of these recommendations. And so I think they'll be implemented short of legislation. Now, some of the budget items may require some budget amendments to be included in the governor's budget. We're still working through that. Again, these are draft recommendations, not final. We'll have to review all of the fiscal impacts, but that may require some budget action on the part of the governor. But again, I think the legislature will be very receptive to these recommendations.
Well, that's definitely great news.
These won't be as difficult to get through as nonpartisan redistricting reform, which I know everyone cares deeply about, as it should, and I congratulate you on that. But these should not be nearly as difficult as getting that legislation passed.
Well, it's good to hear optimism for these recommendations in the future. Well, Secretary Moran, we want to thank you so much for joining us today and for taking so many questions. We really appreciate it. It's great to hear from you and great to hear some of the details coming out of the task force, and we can only hope that that they will prove to become reality, both in the General Assembly session and, as you said, just in best practices on a lot of these campuses.
Yeah. Well, I think because we had such a diverse group of stakeholders, the colleges and universities, community colleges, campus law enforcement, advocates were at the table. I think these recommendations are one that have been socialized throughout the whole system, and they are a result of a lot of hard work on the part of many people. So I thank them for that, and they should be implemented because of that, because they really are ideas that have been derived from a lot of work and from the stakeholders involved. And so I am optimistic, and I think appropriately so. And again, this is about ensuring better safety on our college campuses, and one that's certainly worthy of our work.
Yeah, absolutely. In the governor's task force, I know we'll be reporting the recommendations to the governor on their final meeting on May 28th. So if anyone's watching and they want to come to that meeting, send us an email. You can email james@virginia21.org if you want to attend that meeting, or if you have more questions for us about this. Virginia 21 is driven by young people and driven by students, and so if you're not already involved, you should get plugged into your local chapter and go to virginia21.org to sign up. And thank you so much again, Secretary Moran, for being with us today and for answering everyone's questions. We really do appreciate it.
Thanks for all the work Virginia 21 does. I'm very sincere. I'm glad you all exist, and you do a great job advocating and on behalf of college students. So thanks again for all the hard work you all do.
Well, thank you. We really appreciate it. And thank you to all our students who are on today asking questions, and to everybody that got involved on Twitter as well. We really appreciate it, and stay hooked up with us on Twitter, and we'll keep you posted on what's happening. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.